So good morning, everyone. I'm Tara Ingholm. I'm the assistant to the director at the Institute for Social Research. I'm also a member of the conference planning committee. I have the pleasure of introducing the speakers of our next session, Neurodiversity in the Workplace. Jessica McQuaig is a senior LS&A, so College of Literature, Science, and Arts, faculty and staff disability navigator. Jessica oversees the Faculty and Staff Disability Navigator Pilot Program for LS&A, which was launched in January of 2022. The program now facilitates disability accommodations for employees, leads college accessibility initiatives, and provides education on disability-related topics via consultations, workshops, and asynchronous resources. Jessica joined LS&A in 2018 after working as a consultant for the Canadian and international nonprofits on projects pertaining to accessibility, inclusion, and disability policy. Jessica has non-apparent disabilities and has cared for disabled loved ones throughout her life. She strives to normalize disabilities as part of the human experience and to build enthusiasm for accessibility by design. Stephanie Peck is the LS&A Faculty and Staff Disability Navigator. Stephanie is an openly neurodivergent individual who holds a clinical master's degree in social work from Eastern Michigan University, or EMU. They joined the University of Michigan in August 2023 as an LS&A Faculty and Staff Disability Navigator, where they facilitate the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, an interactive process that determines reasonable accommodations for employees. In addition, she educates individual employees and departments on designing and updating workspaces to transform them into more inclusive environments, specializing in neuro-inclusive and physical access planning best practices. Stephanie also has multiple years of experience supporting students with disabilities, including serving as a lead student accommodation specialist at EMU. She was a catalyst in the success of the EMU College Supports Program, the second autism support program of its kind in the country at that time. Annie Hensler is the Disability Cultural Graduate Student Staff Assistant for the LS&A Faculty and Staff Disability Navigators. Annie is a second-year Master's of Public Policy student in the Ford School, focused on education and disability policy. Before joining the University of Michigan, she received her BA in elementary education at the Michigan State University. At MSU, she spent most of her time working for the Resource Center for Persons with Disabilities, remediating textbooks, tutoring students, and running support groups for students with ASD, autistic spectrum disorder, to assist with their transition to the university life and academics. After graduation, Annie hopes to work on preparing teacher candidates to support neurodiverse students in their classroom and beyond, as well as increasing accessibility knowledge within post-secondary education. Welcome.
Do you want to just come over? Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So we are the LSA Faculty and Staff Disability Navigators. Welcome to our presentation. So this is Neurodiversity in the Workplace 101. Part 1. And this is a condensed version of our 4-hour workshop. So we're going to have Part 1 today and Part 2 tomorrow. We're excited to share this space with you here in person as well as those that are attending virtually. We'll skip that one. Okay.
How do I do this? Okay. So in today's session, we're going to start by setting some expectations, understanding that this is a space for learning, reflection, and open discussion. We're going to be entering into agreement as to how we're going to be interacting with this content and assisting in creating a safe space for everyone here. We're then going to be taking a brief look at the history of neurodiversity and how our understanding has evolved over time. Next, we'll explore the idea that great minds don't think alike, diving into executive functioning, spoon theory, communication styles, and coping mechanisms. Finally, we're going to highlight valuable resources to support neurodivergent individuals in the workplace, and we're going to get started with setting our expectations. There we go. So first, no group is monolithic. I think we've heard this about 4 times today. If you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one, not all of them. Lived experiences are going to be varying widely within this room, and we want to honor those multiple perspectives. Part of creating a safe space is us as the presenters and you as the audience buying into the idea that sharing our individual experiences and perspectives to help us grow in understanding. We as presenters are learning too, understanding that this field is always evolving, and we're encouraging curiosity. If you feel a strong reaction to something, take a moment to reflect and ask why. When we feel this internal conflict or the reality of holding 2 truths in our heads, this is often where most growth is going to be taking place. Next, we're going to be inviting questions and open dialogue. Be brave and engaging. We are not hosting a Q&A because of time, but we will be back at our table to take questions there during lunch and networking. And then finally, make sure to take care of ourselves. We're encouraging you to move, stim, use fidgets, or step away as needed. Hydrate, grab snacks, all that stuff. Here, we are all occupying this space as we need to.
So before we get started with our meat and potatoes of the content, wanted to make everyone familiar with some key terminology and language that we'll be using throughout the presentation. So there are 2 forms of language when it comes to talking about neurotypes as well as disability: person-first language and identity-first language. Person-first language frames a neurotype or condition as something that one has rather than an identity that one is. An example of that is saying, I am a person with dyslexia. Identity-first language situates a neurotype or condition as central to one's identity. An example of this is saying, I am dyslexic. There is no universal agreement on which is right or wrong, and there's no shame in either. So we're going to be using both today to help normalize encountering each approach. However, it is important that if you are referring to specific people and discussing their neurotype identity, that you use the format that they prefer for themselves. And that's just a basic way to demonstrate respect for that person. The second pieces of language that we'll be using are neurodiversity specific. So you've already encountered a few of these. The first is neurotypical. This refers to having a style of brain functioning that falls within the dominant societal standards of normal. The second is neurodivergent. This is the opposite of neurotypical, and this term was coined by, Cassiane Asasimasu, who is multiply neurodivergent. And this was intentionally created to build a larger tent for those who weren't autistic, but also didn't identify as neurotypical. Neurodivergent is an adjective, and it's used to describe one person, whereas neurodivergence refers to a state of being. Neurodivergence can be present from birth or acquired during life. And there's another term we'll be using, which is neurominority. This is a newer term that can describe a group with a set of shared traits or an individual. And while we wanted to note that neurotypical and neurodivergent labels can be quite empowering, we also believe that they create this false dichotomy that the brain fits cleanly into one category or the other. The navigators believe that all brains exist somewhere along a spectrum, so some people may not identify strongly with either, and that's okay. And then finally, we have the term neuro-inclusive, which is a core part of our presentation. Neuro-inclusive is used to describe systems and practices that account for variations in brain functioning to deliver experiences that are more equitable and inclusive.
This is Annie speaking. I'm going to get this up. All right, so on this slide, we've displayed a non-exhaustive list of some neurological variations, which is assisting us in demonstrating how large the neurodiversity spectrum really is. When reflecting on the slide as I was preparing for today, I remember the first time I saw this content when I started with the navigators. And I remember how surprised I was by the presence of just a couple of these additions, specifically headache disorders. Just addressing my own biases, I think I had always separated medical conditions from neurological variation, and since working this job, my perspective has definitely shifted. So when discussing the different types of limitations that neurodivergent folks may have, it's really important for us to remember that if our brains have a deficit in one area, they will compensate by enhancing the skills and qualities in other areas. As an example, someone with dyslexia may have phonological deficits, causing them to sometimes misread or mishear words. As a balancing force, it's also common for those individuals to have highly developed visual processing and pattern recognition. And as a fun fact, over 50% of NASA's employees are diagnosed as dyslexic.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the conceptualization of disability. Many minority neurotypes have been framed and often experienced as disabilities, and so our understanding of neurodiversity has evolved alongside our understanding of disability, which is where we begin today. Disability has been understood through three dominant lenses in the past 2 centuries. So first, the medical model was the prevailing model developed at the birth of modern Western medicine. It focuses on determinations of normal functioning in anatomy. So the intention of this model is to look for what's wrong with someone with the goal to fix them and make them normal. It takes the position that disability is something that needs to be cured. Second was the social model, which was first conceptualized in the 1970s by the UK organization Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. The belief here is that inaccessible environments and derogatory attitudes are what are disabling to people. Then these ideas were framed as the social model of disability by academic Mike Oliver in 1983, which is the concept that actually propelled the disability rights movement here in the US. Third, the biopsychosocial model was first conceptualized by George Engel in 1977. It foundationally tells us that disability is a combination of biological factors, how environments are structured, and how a person thinks about their abilities and limitations within themselves and how they fit in society. This model gained traction in the 2000s as pushback on the false dichotomy of the medical and social models continue to develop. On the screen is a Venn diagram that visually represents the biopsychosocial concept that disability is defined by, which is the interaction between biological, psychological, and social factors. Within the biological circle, bodily functions, health conditions, genetics, and medication are listed. Biological factors are aspects of the way our bodies do or do not function, including with medical interventions such as medications. So, for instance, I have a health condition that affects my ability to utilize the already limited dopamine that my brain makes. So without medication, that stops my body from quickly reabsorbing that small amount of dopamine that my brain produces. My cognition and executive functioning skills are even more impacted, and it can be very disabling for me, especially in times of high stress, like right now for me. Within the psychological circle, mental health, personality and self-esteem, attitudes and beliefs, coping and social skills are all listed. Psychological factors refer to the way we mentally frame our situation, which can be impacted by mental illness, personality, and worldview, among other things. If I grow up believing that only non-disabled people can have value to society and then acquire a disability, I'm at risk of withdrawing from my pursuits and ambitions. The thing disabling me would then be my own mindset. Within the social circle, socioeconomic status, access to state benefits, social norms and stigma, and physical barriers to participation are all listed. Social factors are the external realities, such as other people's beliefs about what we can and can't do, or the accessibility level of physical and digital spaces that either allow individuals to participate or disable them from participating. This concept helps explain the many ways in which various neurotypes can experience disabling situations in life.
So next we want to explore a brief history of autism. And the reason for this is because the models of disability can be informative as to why we are where we are in regard to how we explain and understand neurotypes. But there's also a long history that includes many different factors that have shaped our understanding. And while the study of neurotypes has a long history, our modern understanding of neurological differences has really been defined in the 20th century. Today we are going to focus on the contemporary history of autism, and that is because it is fairly well documented compared to other neurotype histories, and it is instructive in terms of the factors at play when humans create neurotype labels and then develop systems in reaction to those labels. We'll see that neurotype labels are influenced by pathologization under the medical model, politics, including world events and opportunities for profit, as well as the worldview of the professionals who document the neurotypes. Autism's recent history also provides insight into why we are where we are today in regard to diagnosis prevalence, diversifying workplaces, and the rise of the neurodiversity movement. I do want to give a brief content warning. In this section, we will be discussing eugenics and genocide under the Nazi regime, as well as traumatic medical treatments used in an attempt to cure or remove autistic traits. So please take care of yourself during this time. We will be sharing slides afterwards, and we do have speaker notes included with those if you want to review this information on your own. So the term autism, where did it come from? Well, it was first described as a symptom in 1908 by Swiss psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler. Autism or autistic psychopathy referred to self-absorption and withdrawal that was often seen in people with schizophrenia, which is it's believed that many autistic people during this time were incorrectly diagnosed with schizophrenia during this period. As a result, they were commonly institutionalized and subject to inhumane treatments that included electric shock therapy. Grunya change this slide. Oh, the green one. Apologies, we are on the right slide. So Grunya Suhariva is an early pioneer in the field of autism research who is tragically underrecognized. I'm going to teach you about her today. So Grunya was a Jewish clinical child psychologist from Kyiv working in Moscow under the Soviet regime in the 1920s. She reported on children exhibiting challenges with social interactions and a range of other traits that are now reflected in our current diagnostic traits for autism. She was very much ahead of her time. Grunya termed it schizoid or autistic psychopathy, and psychopathy at that time just meant a disturbance of mental health rather than the complex personality disorder that it refers to today. Grunya published a series of papers on her findings, which were unknown until recently due to world politics. So she was working at a time when the Iron Curtain separated Eastern and Western Europe and essentially blocked scholarship from moving freely throughout the world. In addition, during World War II, referencing any work by Jewish scholars was extremely dangerous. So even when Grunya's work was referenced, she was not given credit until contemporary historians rediscovered her. And I just did air quotes for those that can't visually see me. For most of the 20th century, Leo Kanner was an extremely influential figure in the autism story. So Kanner was a world-renowned child psychiatrist who moved to the US from Germany in the 1920s. He eventually landed at Johns Hopkins Hospital. There he founded the Children's Psychiatric Service, where he gained a reputation for defining the field of child psychiatry and eventually took a special interest in autism. Kanner published his first paper on autism in 1943, and it was called Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact. Kanner framed autism as a rare disorder that was characterized by social isolation, repetitive behaviors, and a desire for sameness. He also blamed cold parenting as the source of autism. So some of you may have heard of the term refrigerator mother. This is where that term comes from. This generated a lot of stigma and shame among families with a child or loved one exhibiting autistic traits and prevented people from coming forward to seek support. Kanner became the leading US expert on autism and spread his understanding to the rest of the Western world. Due to Kanner's narrow definition and the stigma placed on parents, relatively few diagnoses occurred in the decades that followed. At the same time in Europe, Hans Asperger also recognizes patterns of autism in children. Asperger was a physician who worked in the University of Vienna's Children's Psychiatric Clinic in the 1930s and 40s. He was one of the academics who referenced findings from Suhariva, along with the work of two of his Jewish colleagues, who I'm very intentionally going to name today, Annie Weiss and George Frankl. They worked with him in Vienna, but again, he didn't give them credit due to the punishment that would have been received from the Nazi Party for citing Jewish clinicians, but they were very pivotal in defining autism during this time. Suhariva deeply influenced Asperger's definition of autism. In a 1944 publication, he gave autistic psychopathy a broad definition with a range of traits. However, Asperger ultimately focused on studying autistic children who exhibited extraordinary traits in socially valuable areas of intellect, like math, and insisted that it was more of a personality condition than a disease. This is how he later became the namesake for Asperger's syndrome, which referred to high-functioning individuals with autism. And again, I put air quotes around high-functioning because we don't necessarily believe that there is a clear definition or differentiation between high-functioning and low-functioning in the work that we do. Initially, it was thought that Asperger was trying to spare children with autism from the Nazi eugenics movement by arguing that autism wasn't a medical impairment and emphasizing the value that autistic individuals could offer society. However, evidence was unearthed in the 2010s that shows that his efforts were selective. So records now indicate that Asperger helped to identify children deemed lower functioning following assessment at his clinic, and those children were sent to Nazi death camps. Once again, wartime politics stopped a more nuanced understanding of autism from gaining traction.
Okay, we're going to focus on deinstitutionalization a little bit. So this would be from 1955 to 1980. Depicted on the slide is a local psychiatric facility that was closed in 1991. It's called the Ypsi State Hospital, or Ypsilanti State Hospital. Once these institutions started closing, support requirements would fall on families to figure out. So mostly on their own, they had to figure out how to take care of their loved ones that otherwise would have been in these institutions. There was a lack of community support, very little understanding of the barriers and needs that families were now facing. In the 1960s, applied behavioral analysis, or ABA therapy, for autistic children was introduced as a treatment. ABA therapy is based on behavioral conditioning science, pioneered by B.F. Skinner. Skinner conditioned animal behaviors through provision of rewards. So this would look like food or punishments like electric shock. Like Skinner, some practitioners use physical corrective methods or punishments for problematic autistic traits, and this traumatizes the children that receive this therapy. There are lots of different approaches to ABA, so we're not here to debate the merits and the faults. As we've heard, there are other people that have had very different experiences than this. But we do want to point out that the original therapy framed most autistic behaviors as problems, and they needed to be corrected. This just further stigmatized autistic individuals and induced shame on recipients. Right. So the next slide is slide 6 on our history of autism. There was a fairly long period where the narrow and stigmatizing Canner understanding of autism and a rocky transition to community-based services occurred with no major shifts in the framing of autism. And then enter Lorna Wing. Lorna was a psychiatrist and parent of a daughter with autism. She rediscovered Hans Asperger's broader definition of autism and introduced Asperger's syndrome and the concept of an autism spectrum. Lorna conducted one of the first epidemiological studies of autism with Dr. Judith Gold in London, challenging the idea that autism was rare, as it was then estimated at only 1% of the population. She published her paper, Asperger's Syndrome, A Clinical Account, in 1981. Her research helped define autism in the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, or the DSM, as difficulty with social interactions, communication, and repetitive behavior and rigid thinking.
All All right, next we're going to be talking about Dr. Temple Grandin. She's a renowned PhD animal scientist and one of the first well-known autistic individuals to self-publish about her experience with autism. In 1986, she released Emergence, Labeled Autistic, which is a groundbreaking memoir that provided rare and first-person insight into what it's like to navigate the world as an autistic person. Her work was revolutionary in a time when autism was still largely misunderstood and stigmatized. Beyond her contributions to autism advocacy, Dr. Grandin has had an immense impact on the field of animal science. Her innovative designs for humane livestock handling systems have transformed agricultural practices, earning her recognition as a leader in both science and disability advocacy. Her public presence is reflective of a broader movement towards neurodivergent individuals openly disclosing their diagnosis, advocating for themselves, and shaping public discourse on neurodiversity. She has spoken extensively on the importance of fostering autistic strengths and encouraging employers to recognize the value of different thinking styles. Today, her work continues to both inspire autistic individuals and allies to push for greater understanding and acceptance in all spaces, from education to employment and beyond. And to round out our history of autism, we're going to discuss Judy Singer. Judy Singer is an Australian sociologist on the autism spectrum who again fundamentally changed how we talk about neurological differences. In 1998, she was the one to coin the term neurodiversity in her thesis, initially to describe the differences between autistic and allistic or non-autistic brains. Her work laid the foundation for a new way of thinking about neurological variation, not as a deficit, but rather a natural and valuable part of human diversity. Since then, the neurodiversity movement has expanded far beyond autism, now encompassing a broad range of neurotypes, including ADHD, dyslexia, and the others we discussed earlier on in this presentation. The movement is politically aligned with the disability rights activism and is dedicated to eliminating the stigma historically attached to neurological differences. At its core, the neurodiversity movement makes two key arguments. First, that neurological variation is a natural and beneficial part of human diversity, much like cultural or genetic diversity. And second, that the idea of a single normal or healthy brain is not a scientific truth, but a culturally constructed fiction. These ideas have reshaped public policy, workplace practices, and education systems, encouraging inclusion and accessibility over forced conformity. Judy Singer's work remains foundational to this growing movement and continues to inspire advocacy worldwide.
Okay, so some key takeaways from that history. This history offers a few things to keep in mind when we're thinking about how neurotypes are currently defined and how society's responses to neurotype differences in recent decades have shaped our present state. And this very much shows up in the workplace, but it shows up elsewhere too. First, you may have noticed that the leading figures in autism research and advocacy to date have been overwhelmingly white, and the experience of autism among other racialized groups has been understudied and underreported. This is changing. In 2023, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill hosted the first Black Empowerment in Autism Network meeting. Similar efforts are occurring across neurotypes and racial identity groups. In addition, the studies that defined autism have focused on children who are predominantly white, male, and from Western cultural backgrounds. That has resulted in inequitable access. Today, adults and individuals from other identity groups have a much harder time accessing diagnoses, recognition, and support. Second, global politics and the prevailing model of disability have strongly influenced who has been positioned as the neurotype expert, so it was mostly medical providers for a long time, then caregivers, and only recently are we starting to listen to neurodivergent individuals themselves. It's also influenced which neurotype research has been elevated, acknowledged, and circulated among experts, and which interventions have been deemed acceptable over time. Third, increases in neurodivergent diagnoses are likely due to better diagnostic criteria and lower societal stigma. Once considered rare, autism is currently estimated to be at 2.2% in adults and 2.8% in children. Studies that include more diversity in subjects may result in better definition criteria and another shift in prevalence estimates. Fourth, Framing neurotypes as diseases that require a cure led to stigma and social isolation for generations of neurominorities. It also created an environment where profit-driven and harmful treatment protocols and misinformed stereotypes could thrive. Today, it is no wonder neurodivergent individuals struggle in neurotypical spaces, but neurodivergent people are here in increasing numbers. Fortunately, neurodivergent individuals are now leading the way in reframing neurological difference as a beneficial aspect of our human diversity, and they're also teaching neurotypicals how to foster neuroinclusion. So in this next section, we're going to focus on the many ways and reasons that our brains operate differently. We'll look at some strategies that neurominorities engage in to endure environments not designed for them, and the negative impacts that these strategies can have over time. It's important to note that we believe human brain variation is normal and arguably persists because it provides us with an evolutionary advantage. And together we'll come to understand that great minds don't think alike and require different conditions to thrive. So executive functioning was discussed in Carly's presentation from the Neurodiversity Alliance, so thank you for setting us up nicely here, Carly. But as mentioned, executive functioning is a key part of the difference across the neurodiversity spectrum. And to explain what executive functioning is, it mostly happens in the prefrontal cortex of our brain. This is the thinking part of our brain where we actively process information coming from both our own bodies, so these are external or internal inputs, as well as the world around us, our external inputs. Executive functioning helps us plan, focus our attention, switch gears, and juggle multiple tasks, which Harvard scientists have aptly compared to an air traffic control tower at a busy airport. The cognitive inputs are the planes and include things like our thoughts, our emotions, social cues, environmental conditions, including light, sounds, smells, and temperature, as well as our active decision-making and working memory. Some humans have air traffic control towers that offer a high degree of automation, so they actively focus on fewer inputs or airplanes. So the example I like to give is when I was putting together this presentation, I was listening to music. And the music had lyrics, and my brain was effectively filtering out those lyrics, and I was writing presentation content, and it was no problem. Carly shared that when she's in environments where there's music and talking or other things going on, her brain can't filter out that music. And so that's an example of brains that have little to no automation, and therefore are going to track many or almost all of the planes. As you can imagine, this can become overwhelming if there are a lot of planes flying in and out. And it gets even harder if the air traffic control tower is short-staffed, i.e. if the individual has less energy available to assign to executive functioning activities. Our brains also respond differently to high-stakes situations where there is a perceived risk. At work, this can include situations where we receive assignments, are evaluated, have a deadline to meet, or are exposed to conditions that mimic a past traumatic event. To illustrate how executive functioning may operate under pressure with our airport analogy, let's imagine that a VIP's plane is flying in. Some control towers are going to stay organized and prioritized. They're going to land the VIP's plane first and then get to all the other planes in a timely manner. Some control towers are going to hyper-focus. The VIP's plane will get directed especially well, but all the other planes will remain grounded or be left circling the airport for hours. Some control towers will see the VIP's plane and devolve into chaos. The VIP's plane won't land, and neither will any other planes. This last example is an illustration of how our executive functioning can be hijacked by a single input, whether it's stress that spirals into a panic attack, intrusive thoughts that drown out all other thought, or smells that trigger our flight or fight response. In each case, the control tower basically shuts down. Beyond external influences, executive functioning is affected by physiological elements, including the presence of hormones like dopamine or serotonin, the presence of inflammation markers, which is a connection to that gut microbiome brain connection that we heard from one of the students earlier, as well as neural pathways, which can be altered by illness or injury, such as traumatic brain injuries. When our executive functioning system is overloaded or stressed, there are several impacts. So we are going to sort, store, and access information in our working memory less effectively. What this can look like is incompetence or forgetfulness. We are going to struggle to shift attention effectively from one task to another. This can look like disorganization or lack of focus. Alternatively, if we're hyper-focused, it can look like ignoring or minimizing other requests. We may fail to direct our focus if the brain is flooded by one or more inputs. This can look like confusion, panic, or unresponsiveness. We may be less able to regulate our emotions and impulses. This can look like anger, defiance, being oversensitive, or engaging in behaviors that are out of character or not appropriate for the situation. It's important to understand that if we have long-term overload of our executive functioning systems, it can lead to burnout, and we're going to discuss burnout later in this presentation. Executive functioning differences are not inherently good or bad, and again, they're arguably still here and persist because they provide some benefit to us. So an example is hyperfocus allows people to get a lot done in a short amount of time under a high amount of pressure. And being attuned to multiple inputs is a good survival trait when you're in dangerous environments. There are tools and techniques that can support executive functioning regardless of neurotype, and we are going to discuss those in part 2 tomorrow. We're coming back tomorrow.
Okay, we're gonna pivot a little bit. So everybody's gonna have access to our slides, all speaker notes, everything that we say, you will have access to all of that. We have a video to share and did format it properly. So this video though talks about spoon theory. Some of you may have learned about this, but spoon theory can be used in lots of different ways to show examples of how in different settings and with different conditions, people experience limited energy. And so this specific video will give you examples of what it's like in a workplace to utilize your spoons or your limited energy in different ways that might impact you each day or people around you that you're working with, just to give a better understanding of people's different tolerance levels and how much energy it actually takes to complete tasks each day. I'm going to skip this slide and let you go, Annie.
All right, this is Annie speaking. Did you know that over 70% of communication is nonverbal? For neurotypical folks, this means we're looking at things such as tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, and even the speed of speech. And they all play a large role in how we communicate. For many neurodivergent folks, processing all of these at once is really overwhelming. If these cues are absent, how then does communication look? First, we're going to be looking at the image in the top right of this slide. Here we're seeing YouTube creator Charlie the Prophet, who lives with schizoaffective disorder, a condition containing both schizophrenia and depression. Charlie is often speaking about flat affect, a condition characterized by minimal emotional expression. In this top image, Charlie is showing broad or full affect. This is the facial and vocal expression typically expected in neurotypical conversations. Charlie experiences this when on a specific medication. However, they speak about how there's many uncomfortable side effects and they don't feel like themselves on this medication. Now, in the second image, underneath, Charlie is showing blunted or flat affect, which is a reduction in tone and expression, and flat affect being almost none at all. Here, Charlie's off the medication and feels more like themselves. However, they work on trying to feel comfortable in social interactions when they are not typically expressing emotions, how others might feel. Flat and blunted affect doesn't mean someone isn't feeling emotions. It simply means it's not expressed in the expected way. For us, this means we must understand and respect various ways of expressing emotions. To be engaged, feeling, or thinking deeply does not require a specific look, sound, or movement. Learning to communicate across differences, including recognizing flat or blunted affect, is how we create a more neuro-inclusive workplace and community.
Within our slides, you'll have access to the 2 different videos where Charlie talks about their experience on medication and without medication, and why they decide to take it or not take it. It's pretty insightful. We're going to take a look at that later. But right now we're going to talk about coping mechanisms. So masking refers to concealing or suppressing aspects of one's traits or conditions to fit within the norm. This includes mimicking behaviors that the individual has noticed or has been expressly told are situationally appropriate. So for example, using conversation scripts, actively monitoring their facial expressions and vocal intonation, suppressing movements that typically allow for greater focus or relaxation. Masking is common among individuals with marginalized neurotypes and is done to blend in and hide traits that are deemed abnormal, manage perceived threat, and make others feel more comfortable around them. Masking is not intended to be deceptive. It's a survival technique that can have negative effects on mental health and well-being, as it requires a significant amount of cognitive and emotional energy to consistently suppress one's natural tendencies and demands a lot of executive functioning capacity to manage. So this goes very well with the spoon theory and the explanation of how hard it can really be to exert so much energy that's not natural to our body and our thought process. The less energy or spoons you have, the less effectively you can mask. And then stimming. Stimming is defined as repetitive, automatic, self-stimulatory behavior. It results in self-regulation of the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for responding to dangerous and stressful situations. It launches us into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or friend mode. We can keep ourselves regulated. If we can keep ourselves regulated, our sympathetic nervous system is less likely to become activated. And that's where allowing people to stim can be extremely helpful and beneficial for not just them, but for everybody involved. Stimming is proportionate to the amount of dysregulation and sensory overload that someone is experiencing. So those who are more sensitive to sensory inputs or are more easily dysregulated will often engage in a higher degree of stimming. We all do this to varying degrees, right? So thank your body. And don't stop someone from stimming unless the behavior is unsafe or violating workplace conduct standards. So we're saying workplace because we're focused on supporting faculty and staff, but this is true for everybody in any space. On the slide we've shared, there's a photo made by a person who openly identifies as having ADHD, and her website is called Molly's ADHD Mayhem, and it lists a lot of common stims. And so I'm going to read them for accessibility, but also just to remind all of us that we probably do a number of these ourselves. So humming, snapping our fingers repeatedly, pacing, whistling, repetitive blinking, rocking, picking, that could also be like your fingernails, or if you're like me, picking water bottle labels off and things like that. Grinding your teeth, tapping your pencil, staring off into space, joint cracking, chewing on inedible items, so that could be like a pencil top or your pen. Making sounds, walking on your tiptoes, complex body movements, punching objects or physically putting force against objects, hair twirling, jumping, hand flapping, biting the inside of your mouth, your lips, your cheeks, spinning, sniffing or licking objects, nail biting, fidgeting in general, so moving in different ways to help us focus. Tapping. Another thing is head banging. That can be gentle, right? But it also can be dangerous. So that might be one of the ways that we would want to help somebody know that they may be putting themselves in a place of harm. And then repeating words or phrases. So there's way more of these, but these are a lot of common stims that you may see within yourself or people around you. We find this is just really important to share because, again, everybody stims, and so we're all a part of this community in different ways. And there's a session I'm asking later if you want to learn more about that at 2:15. Oh, this one's me too. Okay, so risk for burnout. We want to bring attention to the increased risk of burnout for minority neurotypes in environments that are not designed for them. So neurodivergent burnout is a state of extreme mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion that occurs when neurodivergent individuals are subject to prolonged periods of masking their traits and conforming to neurotypical expectations, leading them to a mismatch between their needs and the environment around them. The primary umbrella characteristics of neurodivergent burnout include chronic exhaustion, reduced tolerance to stimuli, increased executive functioning challenges, and loss of skills, including deterioration of executive functioning in ways that are not present without reaching burnout. So we already know we have some executive functioning differences, but this is at a level of where you're actually losing the ability to have these skills present at all. Currently, research focusing on the specifics of ADHD and autistic burnout can help us identify clear differences between these neurotypes. While ADHD burnout and autistic burnout stem from chronic stress, they manifest differently, with ADHD burnout involving exhaustion from managing symptoms and inattention, while autistic burnout is characterized by loss of skills, coping mechanisms, and is often exacerbated by social overload and masking efforts. In workspaces, neurodivergent employees often encounter environments that aren't structured to accommodate their needs, leading to heightened stress. Neurodivergent burnout is exacerbated when employees are forced to suppress their natural ways of working or communicating. In fast-paced workplaces, this suppression can quickly lead to physical exhaustion and mental health issues, such as anxiety, depression, and then full burnout. Tomorrow, we're going to actually dive into part 2 of our workshop, where we're going to review neuro-inclusive workplace practices, including resources for employees and for supervisors. And we have a tangible list of things that can be done as a supervisor to advocate for yourself, but also for supervisors. And we actually have those printed in the back as well, if anybody wants a physical copy.
All right, so to round out our time with everyone today, we just wanted to say that we'd absolutely love the opportunity to connect with you. On the slide, we have displayed our email as well as our website through the LSA DEI office. In addition, we're gonna be around during lunch and in the back if anyone has questions. And if you are interested in a copy of the content shared today, as we said, we script out everything we say so you can go through and see exactly what we said if it wasn't on the slide, access to videos and our sources. You can find that through the QR code or the little link we've generated up above. And then, sorry, I totally just blanked. Other than that, we just want to thank you all for your attendance today, and we're looking forward to presenting part 2 to you all tomorrow.